Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for making it here so early this morning to join our morning lecture. Well, let me tell you first that it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. D Leipziger, one of my old colleagues at the World Bank, as our guest speaker this morning. Dr. Leipziger is currently a professor of international business at George Washington University. Before joining the George Washington, he was the vice president for 5 years, from 2004 to 2009. During his tenure as the vice president, he led so-called poverty reduction and economic management network with more than 700 economists. And he's going to give us talk on China, especially Chinese economy. As you know, China means a lot to all of us in many respects. China represents 20% of the world population, and 8% of world GDP, and 8% of world trade volume as of last year. China is the second largest economy in the world, and China is the fastest growing economy in the world too. But China is facing a number of problems and challenges that China has to solve in the coming years. How to deal with these problems and challenges will profoundly affect many countries, including Korea. So I think it's a very opportune time to make a careful assessment of China's policy in order to find out what the world picture will be like in the coming years. And as I said, Dr. Leipziger spent much of his career with the World Bank. I recall that he was the division chief of Asia Desk when I joined the World Bank in the mid-1980s. And since then, he developed himself as a foremost economist and expert on East Asian economy, including Korea and China. And so the talk today will be very, I guess it will become a very meaningful event. And so he is an expert of Eastern Asian economy. He has naturally has written a number of books and articles on East Asia. To name some of them, they include, for example, Korea Transition to the Maturity, which was written in 1988. And it was time when Korea made a high growth. And this report was very widely read inside and outside of the World Bank at the time. And he also wrote Lessons from East Asia in 1997. He also wrote Preventing Banking Crisis in 1998. And most recently, he wrote a very important book named titled Globalization and Growth and Implications for Post-Crisis World. He wrote this book together with Professor Michael Spence at the Harvard University, who is a Nobel laureate. And I think it's time for me to present Dr. Leipziger to speak for his subject today, China and China's economic policy. Okay, thank you. And please welcome him warm to us.
Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's very nice to see you. Thank you, Dr. Nam, for the very kind introduction. I think it's no exaggeration to say that although I've spent a number of decades examining and benefiting from the experience of Korea, that Korea has also been very good for my career at the World Bank, so I appreciate that. So I was asked to speak about China, and I think it's a topic on everyone's mind these days. And so let me give you some basic information. Let's see. Are we going to go with this? Okay. So to give you a snapshot of China, in the world's worst economic crisis of the last century, probably, or since the Great Depression at least, China's economy still managed to grow at 8.7% in 2009, in contrast to negative growth rates in other parts of the world. And in the first quarter of 2010, on an annualized rate, China is growing at close to 12%, which I put here as sort of an overheated rate. Double-digit growth is very hard to sustain. Now, the composition of growth changed, in particular during this crisis, because the Chinese authorities instituted a very large fiscal stimulus package to make up for the fact that exports were obviously lagging. So you see a change in the composition of demand in this 2008-2009 period. At the same time, you see housing prices going up quite substantially, almost 12% nationwide, and 32% in the 36 largest cities in the last year alone. And this is obviously why people talk about concerns about a real estate bubble. The exchange rate has, since the end of 2008, been, the term used is repegged to the dollar after some appreciation over the previous period. Obviously, the Chinese authorities felt that in this crisis they did not want the exchange rate to continue to appreciate. This is a controversial topic, and I'll come back to it in a moment. So the external picture of China is quite mixed. Although the exports dropped precipitously in the second half of 2008 and early 2009, this was quickly reversed. So there are very few countries, perhaps other than Korea, that actually are experiencing this V-shaped recovery that you read about in textbooks. At the same time, the trade surplus has dropped from, at one point, close to 10% of GDP. In 2008, it was 8%, and 2009, it was 5%. That's sort of the good news. The bad news for those that are concerned about imbalances is that 5% of GDP surplus is still quite substantial, and this has led to an increase in reserves, rumored to be roughly 2.5 trillion at the moment. So at the same time that exports declined and then resumed their recovery, there was this shift in composition. And the shift in composition has seen exports drop from about 40% of GDP earlier in this decade to 27%, and a commensurate increase in government investment. Well, if this gets distributed, you'll look at it. It's too hard to see in the back. I apologize. There's only one line that I particularly found interesting, and that is the calculation of the output gap. the difference between where the economy is performing and what the potential growth rate is. And I'll come back later to the fact that I'm not a great fan of these calculations of potential growth rates, not because they're done by my former sister institution, the IMF, but because I don't believe that all the factors in the potential growth rate calculations are immutable. They're not subject to policy change. But the interesting point is that in 2009, 2010, and the forecast for 2011, the Chinese economy is basically operating at its full potential. There is no output gap according to these calculations. And one has to wonder how long an economy can produce at that potential growth rate without inflation starting. So, an honest assessment of China's prospects in the next few years has to be rather positive. And it has to be rather positive because global exports have recovered, consumption is stable, and this will allow government to reduce its fiscal stimulus. The stimulus in China has been reported to be close to 6% of GDP, although when you look at it in terms of fiscal accounts, you only find about half of it. So half of the stimulus package was financed off the balance sheet, basically, of the central government through the banking sector. The labor market is their major preoccupation, and the reason why the exchange rate is in part not been allowed to find its natural price. But despite some initial increases in unemployment, the domestic stimulus package, which substituted government demand, largely in infrastructure, for the exports, has basically absorbed a fair amount of the labor. Inflationary expectations, well, if you look at the double-digit growth in early 2010 and you look at housing appreciation, you would begin to worry about inflation, particularly if it weren't China. China has some mechanisms that enable it to deal with inflation the way market economies, strict market economies, obviously would not. But one would think that under those circumstances, tighter monetary policy and exchange rate appreciation would be the right combination of tools to deal with inflationary expectations. I'll come back to that again later. So as I said, China's operating close to its growth potential, while in the U.S., for example, the economy is 5% below. So this is a very dramatic picture of potential growth rates for the U.S., Japan, and Germany. And even if you can't see it in the back of the room, it's just a big U, and it's below potential. And for all the major economies, it only gets back onto its potential growth rate trend by about 2014. It gets closer in about 2012, where it's only 1 to 2 points below potential. But if you really wanted to get back to full potential, this is the growth path. So this contrasts to China, which is operating close to its potential, and gives you some idea as to why people have been relying on the Chinese demand. These two graphs, and I think these are the last ones that the back of the room won't see so well. On the left, we're plotting what happened to private consumption over the last 25 or so years, and on the right, what's happening to fixed investment. And you see that, in general, consumption was coming down prior to the crisis, and fixed investment was increasing. This trend on consumption in the 2008-2010 period, consumption is basically flat in China. exports obviously fell, and it was taken up, the piece of aggregate demand that was missing was taken up by government spending. On the right, we're basically plotting the percentage of GDP that's accounted for by the service sector, by services, compared to the log of GNP, or GDP, and it basically shows, these are obviously 100 countries in the world, it shows that China is below trend when it comes to the size of the service sector. So that is a natural phenomenon of development, that the service sector will grow, but it gives you a sense that China is significantly below trend. Another imbalance, if you want to put it that way, is the location of where GDP is produced. No one says that there shouldn't be growth poles or centers of growth, but you see geographically by the size of the circles that GDP is essentially produced by coastal provinces. This is no news to anybody working in China, but it's sometimes good to see the map of the entire country and realize that this is at the heart of a lot of transition problems that the country has faced. First, hundreds of millions of people coming from rural areas to the coast for employment, and also very large income disparities between urban and rural, and between the major growth poles and the poorer parts of the country. This is not an issue for short-term economic management, but it clearly is an issue for longer-term economic management. So the government's policy stance coming into 2010 has basically been that they realized that in 2009 they pulled out all the stops to get the economy, to keep the economy on as high a growth path as possible. I already said that on the fiscal side, even though the numbers show a 5.8% fiscal stimulus, the deficit, the fiscal deficit is about half that. So nonetheless, there was a tremendous fiscal effort. This was matched by very loose credit. And credit growth in 2009 of 30% would make even Alan Greenspan look like a conservative on monetary policy. And although this year they say that credit will rise about 18%, they've also instituted some measures, be it on reserve requirements of banks or curbs on second or even third home ownership. And obviously China has some means at its disposal that are not in the classic textbook of central banks. But you can expect some monetary tightening. At the same time, as I said, fiscal stance will remain stable, and the deficit is still in the manageable range, although there are problems reported at the local government level. Why? Well, because local governments are able to create state enterprises at the local level by either mortgaging land, selling it, borrowing from the local bank. In whatever way, local governments were able to live beyond their means. This is okay when interest rates are low. This is not so good when interest rates start to go up. So that's something that's on the horizon. And as I said, the current account surplus, only 5%, but even 5% is a problem when the world is trying to recover from this deep recession. And I think it's the same concern one might have if you were in the Eurozone, forgetting about exchange rates for the moment, and you have a country like Germany which has a big surplus. So even in that grouping, very large surpluses imply large deficits on the parts of others, and if they don't have the fiscal position to sustain it, you get into this twin deficit problem that characterized the U.S. economy going into this recession. So in the medium term, I think the challenges facing China are to rebalance with the sources of growth coming increasingly from domestic consumption without triggering further inflationary expectations. I think it's remarkable that with the growth rates being in this 9 to 10% range, you haven't seen, except for the housing market, widespread inflation. There may be various explanations for this, but I'd be surprised if that inflationary pressure didn't continue. The second medium-term challenge is the spatial inequalities, because obviously, as I said, this affects jobs, migration, congestion, and one of the stated goals of the 11th five-year plan, which was harmony. And if you look at the map with the dots, it's hard to see a harmonious society with large inequalities. I think a challenge that the Chinese themselves have identified based on sort of growth accounting is that they feel they need to increase the efficiency of public investment, particularly now that it's been given this large jolt, and they need to see increases in total factor productivity. Total factor productivity is a lot easier to raise in manufacturing than it is in services, and we see that in Korea. And so as they make this transition to a larger service economy, although they're many decades behind Korea, they will face the same problem, which is lower TFP. There will be issues, in my view, of economic welfare that will begin to dominate the interests of the population. Obviously, they have the political means to suppress that at the moment, but just as in the OECD countries and elsewhere, there are new concepts now about economic welfare, including the economics of happiness and a number of other variations on the welfare theme. I don't think the Chinese population will be immune to these kinds of pressures. And at the same time, eventually the government will have to review its own role. And as it inevitably will have to step back from some economic decision-making, it will have to create either the institutions or the mechanisms to allow markets to work, but not to allow them to misbehave. And so I think we've learned a lot in this last crisis. And if you saw the book by Akerlof and Schiller on animal spirits, it goes back a number of hundreds of years of economic thinking that markets should not be left unattended, shall we say. But I'll leave that for the Q&A period. But let's take a look at China from a few other angles. This is a very interesting chart that shows tertiary education percentages for a number of East Asian countries. And you see that China is somewhere in between Indonesia and the Philippines, has a long way to go. I also like this chart because it shows Korea versus the OECD average. And Korea, like in ice skating, does a lot better than a lot of other countries. We can also take a look at how countries do in innovation. And I'm not a huge fan of, the number of patents, but it's a commonly used measure. And if you look at this, 100 countries, again, the ones in red, the US, Japan, Korea, and Singapore, are way to the left of this exponential fitted line to the data, i.e., they have much more going on in terms of patents and innovation than does the average. This is only interesting when we contrast it to where countries like China and some other East Asian countries that are sort of a bit behind, I would say, including some successful countries like Malaysia. But China is in this group to the right of the line. Basically, they are below the curve, as it were, in terms of patents, innovation, et cetera, et cetera. So this explains, in part, China's thirst for technology and access to that technology. Someone asked me, how the Koreans should feel about the Chinese wanting access to all of your R&D and technology, and my off-the-cuff response was, well, now you know how the Japanese felt when you were chasing them. So now the shoe is a bit on the other foot. So let me turn now to the long term. As I said, China lags far behind in certain aspects of education that are extremely important for the service economy. I mean, that is the link. You can't get the productivity in the service economy with such a low level of tertiary education. There are going to be issues of health care. My wife is a health economist, and she was recently in China, and she visited some hospitals, and it turns out that the allocations of public monies that go to hospitals in China are based on a formula, the major variable of which is how many pharmaceuticals that hospital dispenses. That times some number gives you the allocation of resources for the hospital. That's not a good way to do health care unless you're in the pharmaceutical business. And it will eventually start to cost them increasingly more, and obviously quality is not high. As I said, China lags in the field of innovation, although it has been very successful in aspects of industrial policy. I mean, one has to be very clear that China's planning has been very good. And you only have to go to Shanghai and look at the model of the city, where they have the little Legos showing you what's going to be built for the next 5 or 10 years. And they're obviously thinking ahead. Now, the building of new cities and new ports, etc., becomes a lot easier when it's publicly financed, and you don't have to go through inconvenient things like hurdle rates and costs of capital, etc., etc. But I think an honest assessment would be that China has been very effective, and presumably it will continue to be so. Nevertheless, the society is aging, and this will create difficulties, as it has for most economies, as the population begins to level off. There are these news reports on television here in the last few days about how the Japanese are going to deal with it by using robots, and that the Japanese public feels more comfortable with robots than they do with immigrants, which is an interesting sociological observation. But nevertheless, whether it was the one-child policy or just normal economic growth, you're going to see a pyramid that's going to change in shape, and you have a smaller, dealing in big numbers in China, but you have a smaller percentage of the population needing to support a larger percent of the population. The pension system is not quite up to standard yet. I mean, there are issues of portability, and if you are a worker moving from one part of China to another, can you take your pension, whatever it is, with you or not? These are big issues. Climate change, I mentioned, is a longer-term challenge. Not so much because the global pressure is going to get to China. I think they're fairly immune to it, but I think they're realizing on their own that not dealing with climate change issues is going to be more costly for them in the long term. And so it's in their own economic interest to deal with it sooner rather than later. And that's apart from pollution in Beijing, etc. It's just eventually the cleanup costs will be higher. Anyway, I have views on climate change, but that's a separate issue. So if I were to look at the international factors that will affect China, I happen to be in the camp that feels that China was given a bit of a free pass on the exchange rate. And that free pass seems to be eroding. We've had in the last year world leaders from Europe. We've had the head of the IMF. We've had a lot of people mentioning to the Chinese that their exchange rate was out of line. But as in most issues of economic policy, I think the Chinese will deal with it because it makes sense for them. And there are good reasons to support a gradual appreciation of the exchange rate. Inflationary pressures will be abated, and B, consumers at home will be able to consume more. And those are two issues that are in the national economic interest. Obviously, you don't want the exchange rate to affect your exports, but I think the Chinese competitive advantage in some of the areas that they're in is significant already, and with increases in productivity, they can make up for changes in the exchange rate. So as I say, this will help consumers help consumers to gain and reduce inflationary pressures. I also happen to be one of those contrarians who is not yet willing to entrust the world economy to one of the new entrants. Let's remember that China's economy is 4.2 trillion compared to a global GDP of 60, the U.S. somewhere about 14. China is extremely important because of its demonstrated impact on global growth. It's very important because of its demand for natural resources, et cetera, et cetera. It's important because it has this huge stock of reserves. It's important because it's a very high carbon intensive growth path. Those are all important, but let's also look at 4 versus 60. That is the size at the moment of China's economy. The level of reserves, here I have 2.8 trillion, which is I think the number that will be the number at the end of 2010. Just imagine, that is in a country with a per capita income of perhaps 3,500, or you can fiddle with purchasing power parity comparisons, say even 4,000. That's $2,000 per head. Half a year's earnings that every Chinese citizen has sitting in the Central Bank of China. That's a fairly large number. If put to referendum, which obviously it wouldn't be, I would expect the Chinese public would prefer to spend some of that money. What can China learn from the Korean experience? Well, I would say first that the exchange rate is only one of the tools of national economic policy. Korea was always conscious of the competitiveness of the exchange rate, but it never allowed it to be so far out of line that it either A, caused international difficulties, or B, allowed policymakers to forget other aspects of economic policy which are also important. Second, the transition to a more balanced economy favoring consumption can be successfully navigated, but in my view it requires a strong and safe financial sector. When people ask me, how did Korea make this transition to encourage more consumption, my answer, usually a bit tongue-in-cheek, is 2 words: credit cards. And I think if you walk around Myeongdong, you'll see how that transition occurred. More seriously, I think if you want the Chinese public to increase consumption beyond the speculation in housing, a prerequisite is to deal with the financial sector so you don't get yourself into difficulty. It obviously requires effective regulation, in part because, the capital account is not open in China and the exchange rate is not flexible. So when those things occur, they need to be preceded by some regulatory changes. And as I've mentioned a few times, the importance of the service sector highlights the area of education and the knowledge economy, which in some parts of the world is just a catchphrase. Here, I think, apart from renaming the ministry, it's been a very clear agenda item for the government. I took a stab at what some implications might be for Korea of the Chinese economy going forward. I think that China plays this sort of interesting role as a hugely important market, but also a strategic competitor. So apropos my comment about Korea and Japan, it's not totally misplaced, which is one needs to operate in China because of the size of the market, but one also needs to realize that they are a strategic competitor. What that means for the way in which companies operate in China, I think, is very sector and corporation dependent. I read a lot about joint ventures. I don't know if these joint ventures are hugely profitable or not, but everyone wants to have a foothold. I know, at least for American companies, I think it's a mixed picture. I think technology is obviously the key determinant of competitiveness. Korea is spending a lot on R&D and is trying to identify future industries. I think it's interesting that in the 1980s, Korea was largely criticized for the heavy and chemical industry experience, and it was a mixed outcome at the end. But without that, you wouldn't have some of the big corporations being internationally successful today. Now, industrial policy still exists. It's fortunately not connected to a repressed financial sector, so it's not that, subsidized credit is necessarily going somewhere. But there is this, I think, very interesting and, in my view, productive relationship between government and business in identifying future sectors that may be competitive based on technology. And technology has aspects of a public good that makes it amenable to public policy if done in the right way. I think Korea's three-leg policy of exporting to the U.S., the Euro, and the Chinese markets was obviously sound and worked well. At least one of the three markets was functioning pretty well in the last 2 years, which I think helped Korea's V-shaped recovery. Now, there's some that are writing editorials about how the world is now a G2 world, including my former boss, the president of the World Bank. But he didn't ask me before he wrote the editorial, and I don't think he would have changed his mind, but I happen to think that this is wrong. I think that China is still an emerging economy, and its goals are quite dissimilar from the OECD countries. I think although it's growing faster than others, it's not on par. And public demand, once it's allowed, will create policy trade-offs and inconveniences that the current government is spared. I think that the prevalence of market interference, whether you see it in the form of Google and intellectual property and privacy, or you see it in other areas, I think China is a less reliable economic partner. You don't have to look at the doing business surveys to find this out. I mean, it's obvious. And I don't think that global concerns are yet sufficiently high up in the list of priorities for China. And that obviously will change. Which brings me to, I think, the last slide, which is a little bit more about the future face of globalization. As our chairman mentioned, we just issued one of the final background volumes of the Growth Commission, which was a commission headed by Mike Spence, in which I served, and Dr. Han Duck-soo from Korea was on the commission, as well as a number of serious policymakers from around the world. And this report came out in 2008 in May, which was not the best of timing. And there was a second report that came out in October 2009 after the crisis, all looking at what are the major drivers of growth historically, and what do policymakers think about it, and what do policymakers advise. And as part of the last round of analysis, we had a number of conferences with basically all the names that you would see in the FT and elsewhere, looking at what globalization might look like in the future. And so some of these papers are put together in this book that Professor Spence and I put out. And I think it's fair to say that going forward, we expect global growth will be lower and below its potential for a number of years, and that this will raise concerns about jobs, distribution, and fairness. And I think in a lot of countries, the commitment to the open trading system will be challenged, particularly where domestic unemployment rates are high, where the distribution of income has gotten rather unequal, like the United States, where the distribution of income has gotten worse over the last 15 years successively, and where the distribution of wealth is even more skewed, and where the average worker has basically not seen an increase in real incomes since the early 90s. And this will have implications for the future for globalization. Industrial policies, however they are called, in my view, will become more prevalent in political economy. So in the same way I alluded to before that there was criticism in the 80s of industrial policy, there was sort of a reassessment in the 90s, and I was one of those, I think, with Danny Roderick and a few others, who was open-minded, I would say, to industrial policy if done in a smart way. I think now the pendulum is turning the other way, which is you see a lot of European countries, France not surprisingly, but even the UK, looking at aspects of what we would call industrial policy. And so, as I said, there's a difference between industrial policy where you control credit and provide it at subsidized rates, and companies have to perform in order to get that credit. That's somewhat different from saying that, you know, electric cars may be a good idea, and there's some technological impediments to electric cars, and R&D could perhaps solve them, and that the government is willing to put some public monies into that technology in cooperation with businesses, but the businesses at the end bear the risk. And if electric cars fail, then it's a corporate failure, not government failure. Nevertheless, I think industrial policy is not the dirty word that it was a decade or two ago. So, as I said, the nexus between government and business needs to work. I think countries that have been successful, many of them in East Asia, but also in parts of Europe, although it's less well known. I mean, Finland has had, I think, a very strong industrial policy. And I think Nokia benefited from that industrial policy. So I think as long as it's revolving around science and technology areas, one can make an argument for it if it's well constructed. So at the end, I think the pendulum is shifting a bit towards the East Asian way of doing things. So that's basically my assessment of China and where it fits in. Oh, I had final thoughts, sorry. I thought you might wonder, you know, what do I think about the Korean economy? So I would anticipate at least that first question. I am optimistic about the Korean economy. I think in the if we go to the second point first, the management of the crisis has been exemplary. I think both in terms of the stimulus package as well as monetary policy, it was done in textbook fashion. I think the monetary quantitative easing, or whatever you want to call it, can be easily reversed. You've had a V-shaped recovery. I think the green growth agenda, quite apart from politics, was a very smart way to package the fiscal stimulus, because I think the big issue in fiscal stimulus discussions is what do you spend the money on, right? So in the U.S. there was a big debate whether it should be tax reduction or expenditures, and then even within expenditures, because there are long lead times, you know, should you just repaint all the bridges? That's a fiscal stimulus. It creates employment. It's probably a good thing, but it doesn't have a huge rate of return. So the green growth agenda, I think, is worked very successfully here. I say this because I'm here with 20 GW MBAs these 2 weeks looking at green technology areas. So I think that this is a good combination of fiscal stimulus with a smart policy going forward, particularly since the green technology is centered around exports. So basically, I think in terms of short term, Korea gets an A. I think in terms of the medium term, things like the green growth agenda are very wisely put together. I think in the long term, coming back to the potential growth rate calculations again, the IMF had, prior to the crisis, done some potential growth rate calculations for Korea, and they showed that over the long term, 2020, 2030, the growth rate was going to come down to a pretty low number, particularly for East Asian standards and Korean preferences. And we took a look at that, a colleague and I, a year or so ago, and we found that there were three factors that could really affect Korea's long-term potential growth rate in a significant way. Significant, I mean raising it by about 2 percentage points if you did everything. Okay, but these are theoretical models. And the three things are: one, retirement age. Given demographics, you cannot afford really to have people retire at 55 if they're going to live to age 80, because for 25 years someone else has to pay for them. And I say this with great humility as I now approach this age where I hopefully will be supported by someone else. But so I think the retirement age is an issue, particularly given the size of the labor force and its peak. Female labor force participation has a long way to go in Korea. It's below Japan. It's way below the OECD. I guess women are now getting into the labor force at junior levels with greater ease, but I don't see that many vice ministers of finance or trade who are women, and I think there are obviously social and other issues to be dealt with, but unless you want robots, Korean women would be a lot better in the labor force, so I suggest that. And then there's the question of TFP. As I mentioned, the service sector is important. So we made adjustments on these three things. We brought TFP up to the levels close to the TFP total factor productivity that you see in manufacturing. We brought the female labor force participation rate up to Japan's rate, not OECD, just Japan's. And we changed the retirement age in these models, you know, from 55 to 62, and you can affect the potential growth rate quite substantially. And finally, so Korea has an opportunity to assert itself globally now using the G20 to its advantage. It should not just be a one-off leadership position. I think Korea deserves to be in the G20. There's some debate about whether every country in the G20 merits membership in the G20, but Korea certainly does, and so it has opportunities for leadership. And many still can see Korea as a much more reliable partner, coming back to the point on China. It's obviously a much smaller market, but a much more predictable and open one. So with that, I thank you very much for for your attention.
Dr. Leipziger, it was very interesting talk. It basically covers not only China, but also implications of globalization. And also he kindly advised the Korean government as to the potential Korean growth lifting. And since he has a lot of stockpile knowledge about the East Asian economies, including China and Korea, not only China and Korea, but also Vietnam, Malaysia, and all ASEAN countries. So now on, we can tap on this stock of knowledge as to what can we benefit from it. And please raise your hand and identify yourself, and please make your comments or questions no more than 2 minutes, please, because I like to squeeze more juices out of.
Dr. Leipziger, thank you very much. Your presentation always is impeccable, and also your delivery is so friendly. It's audible. I have quick questions first. You mentioned the Chinese stimulus was 6%, but they showed up in balance sheet something like 3%, and I like to see the connection between the two. I just missed it. Second one is also a very quick one. You mentioned in one of the charts that 2009, the credit growth was 30%, but this time China was already under the announced policy of credit tightening, and I like to see how their policy of tightening ended up resulting in 30% credit expansion. And you mentioned also the industrial policies, and pendulum is now swinging towards industrial policy. I found the comment very interesting in view of the fact that Japan was, of course, very famous for Japan incorporating the entire country was under the industrial policy at some time. Currently, they are totally out of the industrial policy, so to speak. And U.S., although it was free of industrial policy largely, they did have a specific industrial policy for housing, and that turned out to be debacle. So, in view of those experiences, how would you view the long-term or the trend toward the globalization?
Well, let me thank you for your questions. Let me go in reverse order. I think the pendulum issue. It is true that you could see the housing support as an interventionist policy which failed, and Japan Inc. okay, but it depends how you structure industrial policies. I was careful to put most of my positive comments on the R&D side. I think even if you put industrial policy in a positive light, but you do a lot of other things wrong, it's not going to work. So, coming to the housing thing in the U.S., you had a lot of things went wrong. The fact that the government was encouraging housing ownership, which you define as industrial policy, which is possible, would not have been possible had they not kept interest rates way below what the Taylor rule or any other objective measure would have said. So I guess my answer is that industrial policy can either succeed or fail depending on what the complementary policy environment is like. And I think the U.S. did a lot of things wrong in monetary and supervision, and I think Japan has been doing a lot of things that are keeping it in a negative sort of growth trap. On the credit tightening, I'm led to believe that China used other means to try to tighten, while at the same time still providing credit. I have the feeling that in 2008-9, China pulled out all the stops. they did the maximum on fiscal, they did the maximum on monetary, and then I think they tried to tighten up, particularly on the housing market, but not credit per se. I mean, you have to remember that credit, international credit dried up. I mean, Korea had issues too in 2008 on rollovers, and Brazil, put a lot of money through their state banks when the international markets cramped up. So I would distinguish between overall credit availability and trying to tighten up in the housing market. On the fiscal side, I don't know enough to give you the right answer. I mean, I'm dealing with reports that I've read that said that only half of this deficit showed up as fiscal, that state banks and others were acting in a way that was the equivalent of fiscal stimulus. So whether it was monetary policy of some in disguise, but so I'll have to get back to you on that. I don't have the details of how they did it. I mean, they obviously didn't do it the way the Europeans did it, but I have the feeling there were off-balance sheet ways in which they provided fiscal stimulus. How exactly they did it, I don't know.
Thank you very much for your enlightening presentation. My name is Dong Che from Hana Security. My question is about what kind of political system that China may have in future. Depending on scholars and institutions, that there may be variances on which year the GDP of China will exceed that of America. But many will say that sometime in future, China's GDP may exceed that of America. Korea has been a success model of both of economic development and a transition of political system from dictatorship to democracy. And many people used to believe that once the per capita GDP level exceeds certain level, then people's desire for democracy and freedom is so strong, and political system should be changed. What kind of political system you think China may have in future? Would they be able to maintain this one-party dictatorial system, or they have to change to democracy? And if they change to different political system, then they're bound to have certain turmoil and difficulties. How they can overcome such this transitional difficult time? Thank you.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure economists are the best to answer that question. That people's demands for a better life and more consumption obviously go up with development is clear. That people's interest in democracy is probably not a linear function of economic progress. They're probably quite interested at lower levels of development. It's just that subsistence and other things dominate their concerns. So I think it shows up later just because of the fact that other things recede in importance. I don't think I'm able to predict what kind of system, but I think obviously this preoccupies the Chinese as well. I think if we look at there are models that you wouldn't want to follow. So you have the Russia model, right, which creates party capitalists, or similar to crony capitalists. You can look at Vietnam, which is still a one-party state, but has opened up its markets much more. And you create a new class of people that have a lot of wealth. And that's not good for democratic development. So yes, there may be a time when the Chinese economy surpasses the U.S., whether it's 2030 or 2040, I don't know. Whether or not it'll be a one-party state at that time, I can't predict. The difficulty is it's hard to construct the kind of political system you want. I mean, the closest, perhaps, to a society that was able to shape it the way they wanted was Singapore. But doing it for Singapore and doing it for a country the size of China is a totally different story. So I don't know the answer to that. I don't know the answer to that. I'm sorry.
I'd like to ask a little dedicated question, personal question. How do you foresee that global pressure on Cheongan worship to recent extent, provided that the Cheongan worship is attacked by the Chinese-made torpedo used by North Korea? Since the recent evidence turned out that some remnants of the torpedo propeller is made by the China. How do you foresee the global pressure and also a side effect to the Chinese economy in the future?
Well, luckily I left the State Department in 1981, and no one's asked me any question like that since, because they obviously realize I'm the wrong person. But I think it's a separate issue. I mean, you asked my personal opinion. I think it's a separate issue where the torpedoes come from. If it came from Japan, it wouldn't make the incident any more pleasant. So I don't see the connection to China. I think the more obvious connection is that North Korea and China are pals, right? So if as it appears, the North Koreans were responsible, and the government of South Korea is unhappy about it, you are judged a bit by who your friends are, and so North Korea and China have been close for a long time. So I think that's, if I were a political scientist, I would think I would look at that rather than the physical manufacturing issue to find the answer.
My name is Young Ko from Lotte Economic Research Institute. A few years ago, some experts on Chinese economy raised an issue of non-performing loan in the banking sector in China, which account for a big portion of China's GDP. Some say it varies between 25 to 30% of China's GDP. However, nowadays, such discussions are seldom raised. I wonder why. You also did not mention about the non-performing loan problem in the banking sector in China. So I wonder why. So China maybe successfully resolved this issue or not. Thank you.
State-owned enterprise issues and non-performing loans were among the major preoccupations. I'm assuming that the quality of supervision has improved, and I think, I haven't seen a recent number, but I think the number you remember is the one I remember, but I don't think NPLs are anywhere in that range today. So I think one answer is the problem has gotten smaller. Okay. The second answer might be that with very abundant credit and very low interest rates, a lot of things can be hidden, right? So even if the NPLs now are 10%, you don't hear a lot about it when there's ample credit. So as in any economy, if and when the interest rates begin to increase, and people can't repay, then the issue of NPLs may come back more. My understanding is that the Achilles heel of some of the SOEs is those owned by local governments. So, but then the third way to look at it is with 2.5 trillion in reserves, bailouts become more easier. But anyway, so I mean, those would be my assessment. I think the problem is a lot less than it was a decade ago.
Okay.
That was the same question I was going to ask.
Oh, okay.
Do I get credit twice?
On the environment issue, you mentioned that the Chinese are not doing enough for the environment. I've also heard the opposite comment from the persons working on the issue like this. At places like the Copenhagen conference, Chinese are adamant that will refuse any externally imposed rules. However, inside they are very much worried about the environment, and from the environmentalist, the specialist point of view, they are doing really all they can do to their best, whatever they are doing. But while I'm at it, I would like to ask you also another question. That was, when first I asked you about the 6% versus 3% of the stimulus, one of the concerns, whatever the number is they are spending, most of the government-sponsored stimulus packages are notoriously ineffective, i.e., Japanese example of 12 years of the lost years, they wasted all their money. And how do you see the Chinese stimulus package spent in what way? Was there any of the productive results? Thank you.
To the extent that it was spent on infrastructure that was already planned. I mean, this is one of the difficulties of unplanned economies, such as the U.S., which is you don't have a stock of investments that have been properly vetted that can be accelerated. And so my impression is that the Chinese, because of the planning mechanism, were in a much better position to accelerate investments that had a decent rate of return. So contrary to the painting bridges and repaving roads, which all countries do to some extent to create employment, I have the feeling that they were much more strategic in how they did it. On the climate change, I agree with you that the Chinese will do whatever they're going to do if and when they see it is in their interest, and I do think they see it in their interest. I think 3 or 4 years ago, and even in our growth report, I mean, the classic solution, in a way, to the fact that the Chinese were building one dirty coal-fired power plant a week was to say, well, there's a clean power plant that costs $350 million to build, and there's a dirty one that costs $250 million to build. The difference is $100. They're global externalities. Let's make the Chinese government indifferent between the two. And that would be a classic Pigouvian way to approach it. The difficulty is that when that economy that is producing this extra carbon that you don't want also is running a current account surplus of 8 or 9% of GDP and accumulating reserves that are unknown in modern times, it's very hard to say we're going to subsidize them. And then you have the Chinese issue that you said, which you mentioned correctly, which is that they don't want to be dictated to by the international community. All that said, and I'm not a climate change expert, I do sense that in the last 1 to 2 years, China's position on climate change has changed. I think they're beginning to see it in their own interest. And so then it becomes a question of the power plant at $250 million is cheaper to build today, but the cleanup costs and the reduced life expectancy of the population and increased health problem, et cetera, make it a smarter thing for them they themselves to improve it. So I agree with you. I think that's the trend. Yeah.
And the question is that, well, U.S. views Chinese yuan, Chinese currency,
Yeah.
is undervalued something like 20 to 40%. And of course, China does not admit it. And China put it like a kind of power game between U.S. and China. China declares that they're not going to yield to external pressure on this issue. So, what is the compromising point, do you think, between U.S. and U.S. and China on this currency issue? And if you can you say something? When the China will be able to relax on this issue, and how much, and in what way?
Well, I'm tempted to say August 15, 2012 by 17.3%, but obviously I don't know. I think the undervaluation point is widely recognized. I think there have been a number of interesting editorials that equate the undervalued exchange rate with a different form of protectionism. And some people have even tried to do calculations which would say, well, the undervalued exchange rate is the equivalent of a 20% tariff or whatever. Whether it's 40, I think that's probably a bit high. But let's just take 20. So there's no doubt that the exchange rate is out of whack. Vis-a-vis the U.S. is in a very weak position to impose anything these days, apart from the size of reserves. And I'm not personally so worried about the Chinese dumping their dollar securities, because they'll lose more than they'll gain. So, but I mean, the U.S. has been preoccupied and obviously also aided and abetted the imbalance problem. I mean, the imbalance has two sides, like supply and demand always has. So the fact that the Chinese subsidized the exchange rate implicitly was matched by the U.S., which was over-consuming. And so there's no moral high ground in that equation. So in my talk, I suggested that, similar to the climate change issue, China won't necessarily bow to international pressure, but they may bow to their internal cost-benefit analysis. And I think as long as they can maintain a relatively competitive export bundle, they can afford to see the exchange rate appreciate, because it will be a good anti-inflationary tool and it will increase domestic welfare, domestic consumption. So I think if you told a Chinese policymaker, we looked at your demand curve for your exports, and basically, it's got this elasticity, you can afford to change the exchange rate by 10%, and basically you're not going to feel much pain. I think they're very rational. I think, that would make sense, and they get some international, okay, the Chinese are being more responsible. So I think for them it's a question of making sure that they have sufficient engines of domestic employment. As the economy gets rebalanced, as I indicated, with a greater emphasis on consumption, then they can control employment a little bit more at home, rather than having to worry about the export as being the only driver. And to the extent that they can improve productivity and the competitiveness of their products beyond the pure cost of labor, I think they can also afford to see the exchange rate move. So I don't know when, I don't know how much, obviously, but I believe that in the medium term, as we say, the RMB will appreciate. And I think it's because the Chinese will realize that that that's a smart policy for them.
Well, one of the reasons that they could keep on this de facto fixed exchange rate for long is that they can control, they have capital control in China. And what do you think about the China's future action on capital control in the immediate future or so?
Well, again, I think that's an issue that the Chinese will look at in a very pragmatic way. I have views on capital market opening. Sorry, and I think it's something. Sorry. I think countries basically should move towards more open capital accounts. We have obviously experiences where the regulatory regimes have not been up to speed, so they would need to work on that. I think it's very interesting, however, the current trend, I mean the discussion in the Financial Times and elsewhere is in the opposite direction. I mean, no one wants to go to capital controls and currency and convertibility, but there was a lot of discussion when the Brazilians, for example, put a tax on capital imports. And actually, I wrote a reply to the Financial Times in which I opposed it because I didn't think that it would be effective in preventing the appreciation of the Brazilian currency. It would raise interest rates domestically. It would send a bad signal, for a lot of reasons. And I think everyone agrees that that's correct, that this was not. It was it did not achieve the purpose that the Brazilian authorities wanted to achieve. That said, I also happen to have been on the minority side of the argument when Chile had additional reserve requirements on short-term capital flows. And most Chilean economists, even because a lot of them went to Chicago, were opposed to it. I think it helped Chile in the crises of the 90s. And there's nothing wrong with governments, in my view, signaling a preference against short-term hot money. That's a public policy decision because at the end of the day, when the money flows out, governments are left with, the result. So I see nothing wrong with some disincentive for short-term capital flows. So it's just to say that in the spectrum of laissez-faire and control, there is some point in the middle in which you have some better control over the types of flows without obviously controlling the capital account the way the Chinese do. So I think it's a long answer to your question, but I think they will move towards greater convertibility and greater opening of the capital account. But if I were advising the Chinese, I wouldn't go cold turkey. I wouldn't open from today to tomorrow, and I would discriminate. And I think governments say, we prefer foreign direct investment. That's our first choice. Portfolio investment, longer term, that's our second choice. Short-term money, we're not so interested. It affects our exchange rate, and we have no control of it, and that it makes other aspects of economic policy much more difficult. So I would draw the line somewhat short of complete openness.
My name is Kim Hong-gu, editor of Le Monde Diplomat in Korea. Thank you for your kind presentation. I would like to ask you about the G20 summit. You mentioned about G20 summit last part of your presentation. G20 summit will be held next month in Canada, and coming November in Korea we have G20 summit. But there are some criticism or restrictions about G20 summit. The role of G8, Group of 8 for United States and China's role is called as G2. So there are some constraints of roles of G20 summit, and these days they people say G20 summit were invented to cope with the financial crisis, just for the financial crisis, and G8 will play a major role to cope with some kind of economic system. And there are so many international ratings to control the economy and some kind of international issue. So what is your view about the G20 summit and the role of China and Korea in the G20 summit? Thank you very much.
Well, it's a good question. I think it's an interesting development that the shift from the focus on the G8 to the G20 happened to coincide with a global crisis, which obviously transcended the G8. I prefer actually the G7 because I have a little bit of a problem with the 8th member. But I think the G7/8 are an anachronism. I think that they don't, they don't control sufficient proportion of world GDP to be the spokespersons for it. The G20 is sort of a convenience. It existed, and it was an easy, imagine having an international conference to decide, should it be G10, 15, 20, 25, it would take you forever. And it would be like the UN. So it was a convenient alternative. And it's not a bad grouping, but there's some odd members of the G20, which you wouldn't necessarily put there based on their economic strength or the quality of their economic policy. So it's an imperfect grouping, I would say. And the EU has a seat, which I personally have always opposed because it should be the G19. So I don't think you're going to go back to, to come to your question, I don't think you're going to go back to a G8-dominated world. In part for the reason that Dr. Kim mentioned, that in Copenhagen, it appeared President Obama was making deals with other members of the G20, but not so much members of the G8, right? He was talking to China and Brazil and et cetera, et cetera. So I think it means that within the G20, which is not a bad group in terms of overall world economy, shares, et cetera, there will be different coalitions, different groups that will work on various things. This is an opportunity for Korea if it can connect to some other players in the G20 and assert some leadership. So let's take the Doha round, which is sort of pretty much dead. But if Korea could, for example, get China and Brazil and India together to reinforce the international appetite for sticking to global trade rules and openness, whether it means ratifying Doha or not is another story. That would be a coalition of very powerful international trading economies, right? And since the Europeans are somewhat preoccupied, particularly post-Greece, and the U.S. has been preoccupied and has difficulty with the trade issue because of domestic concerns. I think, for example, the Korean Free Trade Agreement, I don't think it's not about Korea, really. It's about unemployment in the U.S. And that's the reason in my view, it's holding it up. So the U.S. is preoccupied with its domestic income distribution problems and unemployment. The Europeans are now preoccupied with the value of the euro and their fiscal issues. So who's going to take up the mantle this year in the G20 context for certain issues? And I think it could be some subgroup of the G20, depending on the topic. And so I'm not so worried that you're going to go back to the status quo ante.
Okay. One short comment on your recommendation on Korean economy. you proposed three issues for Korean economy to recover to its potential GDP growth. Out of three issues, you mentioned women's labor market participation and retirement age changes. However, I think a decline in potential GDP growth is not caused by a shortage of labor force in Korea, but by a shortage of domestic investment and private consumption in Korea. So in this sense, your stress on the importance of women's labor market participation and change in retirement age does not seem to be consistent with the reality that Korea now faces. So I would like to ask your comments on my view.
I mean, the potential growth rate calculations are basically, for the economists in the group, they come from production functions. So basically you have three factors: capital, labor, and technology. You're focusing on capital. I'm focusing on labor and technology. Now, I don't think lack of capital has been the primary, or will be the primary problem in Korea. You have very high savings rates and you have very high investment rates. So it's an empirical question how much of future growth will come from K, how much will come from L, and how much will come from T. I think we would probably agree that total factor productivity in Korea has declined. I mean, I think KDI or any other institute would have that kind of data. And that total factor productivity in the service sector is usually lower than in manufacturing. So I think we could probably agree on the T. I'm focusing on L, on labor, because if you look at Korea's demographics and you are looking at potential growth rates for 2020, 2030, even 2040, okay, let's go out 20 or 30 years, that labor force is pretty much determined by birth rates today. And the birth rates are rather low. You know, you can attack the labor force issue for the future. I'm not saying it's a problem now, in a variety of ways. You could raise the birth rates. You could do other things. The simple, relatively simple ways of having people work up till 62 or 65. You saw in Greece, for example, you know, they had retirement ages at 55, and now in this crisis they raised it to 67. Imagine, you know, the person's been waiting there. They're 54 years old. They say, next year I'm going to retire. And then they're told you have to work another 12 years. I mean, that's a serious shock. So I was looking at retirement age, and I mean, one can have views. I, in the World Bank, was involved with something called the Gender Action Plan. So we were actually, not for Korea, but in other countries, trying to get more productivity out of the half of the population that happens to be women. You're focusing on K, I'm focusing on L. We can work well together, no?
Okay, I wish we could keep on this very interesting dialogue, but we have to wrap it here. I think he has to leave, and we'll have another occasion sometime later on. And thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you.
D Leipziger, and
thank you
very much from the floor for the lively discussions and the stimulus comments. And we'll see you next time. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.